I'm Dave Schwartz, and this week on Cinema Showcase, my guest is John Addison. John, welcome to the show.
Well, it's lovely to be on the show again.
And this week we have one of your scores from 1977, A Bridge Too Far, right?
Yes, and at the moment it's one of my favourite scores. But you know, it's a funny thing I find about writing film scores. There's a moment when you think it's the best one you've ever done. There's a moment when you suddenly think it's no good at all. And then eventually you see it in perspective.
Okay, we'll get to your score in just a minute. Okay, to start off our program tonight on Cinema Showcase, music from A Bridge Too Far with my guest, John Addison. There's a single version out of the main theme from the movie. Now, you want to tell us, our audience, how this differs from what's on the album?
Yes, it's basically the same idea as the last track on the album, which is called on the album A Bridge Too Far March. A rather curious thing happened on this. When I first wrote the end titles music, which is what this piece is, I was given a timing and we recorded it, but at that time we didn't actually have the titles, and when they arrived they were considerably longer than what I'd written. So we fiddled around in the cutting rooms to see if we could manufacture it, and there was no way that we could do it without spoiling it. So we in fact had to re-record and make a new end titles, and these were, being longer, it did show the tune off better, and we decided therefore to do a single at the same time based on that idea. That's how that came about. So when you hear the last track on the album, what you're really hearing is a short version of the single, but it starts and ends in exactly the same way as the end titles of the film. By the way, at the end of the film, a decision was taken that as the final credits come up, normally you would start music there, or in fact you'd start music a little bit earlier to get into that, but the experience had been that people who'd seen the film up to that point had been so moved and shattered by it that Richard Attenborough had the idea that we should leave 10 seconds before the music creeps in, and I agreed with that idea, and that's how we did it. And it works fine in the cinema, providing people are shattered and sit there stunned. If by any chance they've got a train to catch and for some reason or other the film hasn't gripped them, well then they start walking out and there's no music there, and then to their surprise when they're halfway up the aisle they look around and they hear this drum starting up, and then gradually it builds up. But it was for a specific purpose. It was to give the impression at the end of the picture that in spite of all the harrowing things that we've seen, people, unfortunately, are likely to go on settling their differences by going to war.
Do you often come up with a special recorded single for your a theme? Or was this the first time you've done that?
It isn't the first time, but it doesn't very often happen. It happens more often with the people who are writing in a rock and roll or more pop style. In this case, it was convenient, I think, to have it available for disc jockeys. It's just a practical thing. But there was no particular idea of selling a terrific lot of copies of the single as such. By the way, the music is being played a lot, I hear, on the radio in England, and it's also it's doing very well in Japan and Hong Kong. So, you know, different places react differently.
How did you get the assignment for Bridge Too Far?
I've known Richard Attenborough since one of the first films he did, when he played a schoolboy in a film called The Guinea Pig, and I wrote a school song for that, and that was the first time I met him. I didn't do the whole score, by the way, but I just did the film. It was one of my first little assignments.
Were you both in school together?
Well, we weren't in school together, no, but he was playing a schoolboy in a film which was about a school, and I wrote the school song for it, because Roy Belting, the director, had met me during the war and had a sort of instinct that I would be good at doing film music, and he'd heard some of my concert music, and so he started giving me small jobs to do, and this was one of the first. Now, since then, I have in fact done scores under shows, films which Attenborough has appeared in, such as Guns at Petoskey, but we'd never actually worked together, and very early on he wanted me to do this, but there were a lot of politics involved, and he wasn't able to officially offer me the job early on. And when I was doing Joseph Andrews, which I recorded in London, he was in the studios, in the same studios, Twickenham Studios in London, and I had lunch with him, and he said that he'd like me to do it, and that he was taking the film over to show to Joseph E. Levine in New York the following week, and he'd call me in Los Angeles, because I was just finishing on Joseph Andrews and coming back here to Los Angeles. So what happened? Nothing. Didn't hear a thing. So eventually I called England, spoke to the editor, and said I can't make it out, because Dickie said he was going to get in touch. And he said, well, what happened was that when he ran the picture, the whole thing, he had a feeling it didn't need any music. So I then sent a message to Dickie saying, look, you're going to be showing it in New York again. Why don't I come out to New York and just take a look at it with you? And quite likely I'll have the same feeling, that it should have no music. On the other hand, who knows, I could come up with a few ideas. So that's what I did. And I saw the film, and at the end of it, I couldn't speak. I was very moved by it. I should explain that I was happened to be a tank commander myself in World War II, and so I know I identified very much with the picture. As a matter of fact, I didn't take any big part in the particular Battle of Arnhem that this film was about, but I was on a flank in that battle with my tank troop, and so it brought it all back to me, and I was very, very moved. But when I could finally get myself together, I did say to him that I felt there was a job that music could do, and he accepted that, and we went. He then came back with the film to here to Los Angeles, where he was looping some actors, and I ran it over and over on the Moviola until I had all my ideas down, and then I went through them with him, and that's how we started.
Now, the first track on the album is the overture. How about doing a little setup before we hear it?
Again, there was quite a history about this. Originally, he wanted to start the film rather quietly, as indeed it does start in the home of one of the Dutch resistance people. But my own feeling was that with Joseph E. Levine's name coming up, followed by 14 major stars, that you really had to go for a big sound. And so I wrote this overture based on two of the main themes in the picture, that is to say the march associated with the tank troops, which were known as 30 Corps in the film, and another theme associated with the airborne soldiers who dropped into Holland. And when Dickie eventually came back to Los Angeles, and I played the music over on the piano to him, this was really only 2 weeks before the recordings, because he couldn't get back before then. When I played it to him, he was really knocked out by it, and he was still talking about having this small screen beginning. And I said, well, look, if you're going to do this, I would have to write a different titles, because this will only sound right if it's done big. And so that's how I didn't rewrite it. It stayed that way.
The next track up on our soundtrack album to A Bridge Too Far is a Dutch Rhapsody. Now, this doesn't really appear in the film in this form, right?
No, the theme is associated with the Dutch people and the tragic side of this battle, which started with such high hopes and which actually achieved very little in the end at the cost of thousands of lives. This theme is heard elsewhere on the soundtrack, and in the film it accompanies moments such as when the doctor, played by Laurence Olivier, is driven through the ruins of Arnhems to try and negotiate a ceasefire for an hour to evacuate the wounded, and the expression on his face of horror and sadness and disgust at what he sees. You might say, by the way, could be done without music, but they all felt that these emotions should also be expressed in music, and I did that. Now, the theme does happen to sound very nice when played on the piano, so I couldn't resist just doing an orchestration of it for piano and a light accompaniment, and for the album. And I thought the obvious place to put it was on the second track, so that theme is established.
I think we should make mention, before we continue on further on Cinema Showcase today, that who's starring in A Bridge Too Far? I mean, he's got a big cast list.
Well, I'll read you the list of them all, because it's quite incredible. Dirk Bogarde, James Caan, Michael Caine, Sean Connery, Edward Fox, Elliot Gould, Gene Hackman, Anthony Hopkins, Hardy Kruger, Laurence Olivier, Ryan O'Neill, Robert Redford, Maximilian Schell, Liv Ullmann.
And not one of these people really gets a lot of time in the movie.
No, but there's a good reason for them being there. In order to follow what's going on, you need an instantly recognizable face on the screen, and also another side of it is that they are so well cast that they just come out as sort of really super character actors. The only possible thing that can go wrong sometimes with American audiences that when Robert Redford comes up, there is a kind of sigh around the audience, and so you could say there's a slight suspension of disbelief there. But he's really the only one. Otherwise, they are all extremely well cast. And I mean, for instance, in the case of Ryan O'Neill, now he looks young to play General. I've forgotten the general's name now, but anyway, the general he plays. And if you'd like to check up, you'll find that general was the youngest general in the American Army. So, you know, it is correct, and that really applies all the way through.
Okay, let's get back to some more of the music, and next we have a track called Before the Holocaust.
Now, when you make up a soundtrack album, it's sometimes a good idea to join certain pieces together that appeared in the film to make it less bitty, you know. And in this case, I think there are a couple of different pieces, or possibly three there, but the first one that it starts the track off was for the sequence before the big airlift takes place, when 35,000 troops are dropped into Holland. And it is based on the theme which is used for the paratroopers and the gliders, and in fact all those that come from the air. But it is in a quiet, I don't know how to describe it really, because it isn't exactly apprehensive, and yet I think there is a feeling about it that the next day is going to be the day. And then that segues into other tracks. For example, there's a shot when you see a line of tanks stretching down this narrow Dutch highway. It's an enormous force of armour, and the music then plays what I actually used for an introduction to the overture, a slow version of the tank theme, the march theme, which helps to give the feeling of might and power. And but this did in fact take place before, all these tracks did take place before the takeoff.
Okay, let's see what we got here.
Sorry, I got a bit sort of bogged down that time. Do you think that's all right? Or?
John Addison, well, continuing on here with music from A Bridge Too Far, and next up we have Underground Resistance.
This is another example of several pieces from the film joined together. It ends, if I remember rightly, with music which comes right after the titles in the film, when the resistance leader, referring to the state of the retreating German army, says, ends up with the word panic. By the way, this is all said in Dutch, and I think one of the good decisions they took in the film was to use the languages of the countries concerned, and then they put subtitles on. Well, he says panic, and you then cut to a shot of ragged soldiers walking alongside a canal, and in fact they don't look all that panic-stricken. And so Richard Attenborough asked me to write something there to help that feeling, and he was very thrilled when he heard this, because it does make the scene work the way it was meant to. Now, people sometimes say, what good does film music do? Can it save a scene? Can it make something work that doesn't work? Well, I don't think that any music can actually save a bad picture, but along the way it can certainly do a lot to help. And if the balance is a little out, or there's something a little bit lacking in a film, the music can give the impression to the audience that they're seeing something slightly different from what they're seeing, because the music's working on their emotions. They may not even be aware of it. And certainly in this case, this bit of music did help that. Now, it is preceded by other sections of quite quiet music derived from the Dutch theme, and this score has been described as a symphonic score. Well, now, I think that's a slightly strange word to use. It can mean different things to different people. But certainly, if it means that it's all loud, that is not the case. Some of it is very lightly scored indeed, and you'll hear some bits on this track, and of course there are others coming up.
How many main themes do you actually use in this film?
3. The march theme for the tanks, the Air Force theme. By the way, there were Poles, Americans and British in the airdrop. And the 3rd theme associated with the Dutch people and the things that went wrong. After all, you see what happened in this battle was that the Germans were on the run. The Allies had landed in Normandy and had fought all the way across France, and I was with them in my tank. You might be interested to know that I did in fact have to leave the battle for a short time because my tank was blown up in Normandy, and this actually was a tragic event, not for me because I was only slightly wounded and I soon got back, but 3 of my crew members were killed, and 1 who was badly wounded I managed to drag out of it. But anyway, the battle itself had been successful, and the Germans were on the run, and they had reached the border between Belgium and Holland, and our particular group did in fact liberate the important town of You see, I've tried. That's what's marvellous when it's being edited. Because you can think, Antwerp, right. I'll say that again. The group that I was with liberated the important town of Antwerp, which was the main port that was going to be needed later on. Unfortunately, the port wasn't taken at that time, and this had a big bearing on why this battle took place, because it was a kind of gamble thought up by Montgomery but sanctioned by Eisenhower, in which the tank forces were to make a strike of 62 miles behind the German lines to the Rhine, cross over the Rhine, and then enter Germany in their industrial area of the Ruhr, and by getting in there, that would have ended the war. But before they got to that last bridge, they had to go over 6 others, because Holland is a country which consists to quite an extent of reclaimed land, and it's all canals and rivers. And the idea was that this huge airborne force was going to drop on these, over this, make a carpet of 62 miles, and take all these bridges on the way. And if they failed to take any of them, well, then the whole thing would be held up, and new bridges would have to be built. The famous British Bailey Bridge was one that we see being built in the film. But also, if the tanks weren't able to make very quick progress along this narrow road and reach the people at Arnhem, which was the last town, the one over the Rhine, in time, those people would run out of supplies and ammunition and would be decimated, and the whole thing would be a failure. In fact, the tanks got to within 1 mile of their objective, but they couldn't make it, and that's why the thing was a failure. And one of the problems was, which I know from having been in those tanks myself, is that if you have a bog either side of your road, when an anti-tank gun opens up, and you never see it because it's always camouflage, the first thing you know is that your first tank goes up in flames. These were American tanks, by the way, Shermans. And so normally, in normal country, then the others would quickly take cover, get themselves hulled down or behind in trees where they couldn't be seen. But on these roads, very often, if you got off them, you just sunk into a bog and you were stuck there. And this was, again, one of the reasons why the battle was not successful. What happened was that the infantry would then have to go round and knock out the anti-tank gun before further progress could be made. And they were supposed to get from the border to Arnhem in 3 days at the outset, and actually after 9 days they still haven't made it. But anyway, I'll tell you a little bit about the story. What were we actually talking about?
We have airlift coming up.
Yes, well, when the forces actually took place, this was the biggest airborne force which had ever landed at that time. It was larger than the original landing in Normandy, and the music for this, I felt, had to have a lot of weight to it, because this is what it was all about. As a matter of fact, a lot of these airplanes didn't travel very fast at all, but what they did represent was an enormous weight of power and strength that was going to land in Holland. Now, the people do not look exactly brimming over with delight to be going. I suppose their emotions were, well, thank God, at least now it's happening. You know, when you're waiting for something to happen that you've been training for years, there is a certain feeling of let's get on with the job. But therefore, it couldn't have a very high-spirited element in it. This I think, is the case with the music for the tank people. In the case of the airborne forces. It starts very slowly, and the tempo gradually increases during this piece of music, and there are also certain technical tricks, such as moving the key up a semitone every now and then to heighten the feeling of muted excitement. But basically it is a fairly heavy piece. However, now this probably is the nearest to being symphonic of anything I wrote in the score, but as a matter of fact, to me the characteristic of the score is the simplicity of it, and the fact that it was based mainly on simple march tunes. Before I started writing, Richard Attenborough had suggested that I might even use some of the regimental marches of the regiments involved, and I did look all these up and do quite a bit of research into military music, both American and British. As a matter of fact, I also got hold of some Dutch folk music to see if that might be of any use to me. And
was it?
Well, was it? It told me one thing, that except to a complete expert on the subject of folk music, that it wasn't that different from other European folk music. Now, there may be some Dutch experts who would be very cross at my saying this, but to the general public it certainly wouldn't be. And the main purpose of this was to genuinely see whether there might be a case for using existing music, but mainly for this to sink into my subconscious, which sounds like a rather pompous way of saying it, but what in fact this does happen, and when I'd done this research I decided that it would be better for me to invent my own themes specifically for the job that was required in this film, rather than taking music that had other associations. I mean, for example, the Red Berets, the British Parachute Regiment, have a regimental march, which, believe it or not, is the ride of the Valkyries. Now, the Valkyries happen to ride through, Wagner's Valkyries happen to ride through the sky in 3-time, waltz time. And so the guy who decided to turn this into a march for the regiment had to add an extra beat into it. So, ba-dum, ba-da-dum, bum, dum, da-da-dum, bum, that's the extra beat. And so I certainly didn't want to use that. Although I may say, before now I have been in a film where that regiment has been around, I've been asked to use this. But of course, to anybody who knows Wagner, the association is totally different from that of parachutes in parachute forces in World War II.
And
anyway,
now from Bridge Too Far, we're going to hear the music you composed for the airlift segment.
Yes.
Next up on our Bridge Too Far score, we have Hospital Tent.
This music accompanied a period in the film when James Caan, who had sworn to his captain that he personally would do everything possible to see that he didn't die in the battle. This was set up in a scene earlier on in the picture, and there is a very exciting sequence when the captain has been shot in the head, and by the way, this actually happened, like everything else in the film, it's real. And the sergeant, played by Caan, picks him up, puts him in his jeep, and drives him back to a field hospital through the German lines. And it's a kind of miracle that he manages to get him back. And when he gets him back, the doctor, the field surgeon, thinks that the captain is dead and refuses to operate on him. And Caan, at the point of the pistol, forces this surgeon to examine him, and of course he finds he is alive, and he operates and gets a bullet out of his skull. And once again, this story is true, and these people are living today, both the man who did the operation and the man who was shot through the head. And the sergeant obviously it will be court-martialed, you think, as a result of doing this, but he had to do it to save his captain's life, and he sits outside the tent, waiting while this operation takes place to see whether his captain will survive or not. And this short piece of music that I wrote accompanies this scene. Now, as you will hear, it is only written for comparatively few instruments and expresses, I think, what is going on in the sergeant's mind while he's waiting.
Arnhem. Okay. What do you have to say about that, John?
This consists of two different pieces of music, including the music I wrote in two places in the film, concerned with the actual bridge at Arnhem. Now, as I've already said, the Allied troops had to go 62 miles behind enemy lines to get to Arnhem. Arnhem was the bridge over the Rhine. This was the object of the whole exercise, and it happened that a British group from the British 1st Airborne Division had the task of holding the bridge there. When they finally arrive, and various things have gone wrong before this, they get glimpses of the bridge, and then they finally occupy the houses at one end of it. And I felt that this had an almost mystical, a symbolic quality about it. Now, why I mention this is because the film on the whole is extremely realistic. All the battle scenes are done with a documentary quality, which was why Richard Attenborough had first of all not wanted to have any music at all, and then when he did decide it that I would write a score, wanted it not to sound like, quote, film music. Also, why we decided that there would be no music in the actual battle sequences as such. Now, this, however, was something else. The fighting that takes place is extremely realistic on the bridge, and I think brilliantly done. And there's no music when any guns are going off. But when they first see this bridge, and later when they start cautiously to advance along it, there is music which I think does create a certain quality about what this bridge meant to them. It's just not any old bridge, as you might say. And also, obviously, there's an element of mystery about it. Any moment somebody may start firing and they may all be killed. Now, in this, you will hear that there are phrases of a solo piano, and it is the only time in the whole score that I used a piano. Now, piano is a rather peculiar instrument because it is kind of outside the orchestra, but it can also be inside the orchestra, used in certain ways. But on the soundtrack, as you know, the second track on side one does feature the piano, but this is not in the film. And nowhere else in the score, in the film, or in fact on the album, do I use the piano, but it does give a slightly strange effect. And because the thing is basically an open air, outside situation, using a piano which is somehow has more of a boudoir feeling about it. Piano is something people don't normally play the piano outside, except perhaps at a rock concert. So I suppose that's why I did it. But on the other hand, maybe that wasn't why I did it. As you work on film music, which I've done for a long time now, you develop a sort of instinct. Certain things will work, And it's sometimes you're hard put to explain why. You've just got to feel it. It's a hunch. And then, of course, it's very exciting when you come to the recordings and the director's there with you, and he sees it have an incredible effect on his film. Conversely, if the thing is a disaster, that's that's not so good. But usually I find my hunches work out these days.
We have more bridge music upcoming, right?
Yes, Nijmegen Bridge was a different situation altogether. Now, can we stop 1 minute while I collect my...
Okay, back to A Bridge Too Far. We have more bridge music, right?
Yes, Nijmegen Bridge was a very beautiful bridge over, I think it was the River Maas in Holland, which was one of the bridges which they had to pass over in order to get to Arnhem. And to take it, it was necessary for the ground troops to cross the river so that it could be taken from both ends simultaneously. And this was a hair-raising experience. The casualties were appalling because the boats they had to get across the river afforded no protection, and they put down a smoke screen, and unfortunately the wind changed and blew the smoke screen away. However, enough of them did get over, led in a film, by the way, by Robert Redford. And incidentally, I would like to mention that the actual colonel who led this advance in real life happened to be incredibly good looking and looked like a film star. And I just mention this because all these stars have been cast very accurately. Having got across to the other side, the tanks start advancing, and we know that the bridge has been mined, and that the German general, despite the command of his superior that on no account is the bridge to be blown, we know that if the tanks get to the middle of that bridge, he's going to blow it up. And when we first see the tanks, the music starts up, and what does it do? Well, it has something to do with the tension of will the bridge be blown up or not. But it I think is not conventional in that way, because it also has quite a strong feeling of what those tank people are feeling inside their tanks. The desire to get on and make the thing a success. Now, technically, I did this by using a repetitive figure in the bass with brass figures over the top, based on the theme associated with the tanks, naturally. Now, in fact, when they press the plunger to set this charge off, it doesn't go off. And in real life, there were three different possible explanations for why this happened. Nobody knows for certain why it didn't go off, whether it was just a malfunction or whether there was a Dutch underground resistance worker who'd put it out of action, or for some other reason. Richard Attenborough was inclined to think, after all the research that was done on it, that it just simply didn't happen to go off. It was just a sheer piece of luck. Anyway, when that happens, there is a big surge in the music, and this is quite important because it helps give the feeling that they're going to make it. And at that time, I'm sure those tank troops did think they were going to make it. But the actual shots that you see, after all you can see is just a head sticking out of a tank. And that doesn't tell you an awful lot about what the guys inside are feeling. And so I think that that's a useful purpose that the music served in that particular sequence.
Okay, we've got some more march music coming up, the March of the Paratroopers.
As a matter of fact, these are two marches. It is a march version of the airborne theme, because these guys are now on the ground, and in the film it is heard when they're going through the streets on their way to Arnhem Bridge, being cheered by the crowds, who all think that they're going to be liberated and that the end of the war has come. The commander, however, is aware that it may not be that easy, and says so. However, the feeling of the music is all of gaiety, and it is rather military bandy. Now, the second march in this is the one that is associated with Colonel Stout, who is played by Elliot Gould. He apparently was a great character and invariably went through his battles with a cigar sticking out of his mouth. This was in real life, and indeed Elliot Gould does have a cigar sticking out of his mouth as he plays this. There is an element of humour in his particular scene, and there's a difference in the march I wrote for the sequences in which he's involved. For those who know about music, marches are usually in 4/4 time, let's say 4 beats to the bar, or in 2/4 time, 2 beats to the bar. But it can also be in 6/8 time, which is a 2 beat divided up into 3 to each of the 2 beats. Yum ta tum, yum ta ta tum ta ta tum ta ta tum ta ta, that rhythm, as opposed to plonk, 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 plonk. Now, when we discussed the music before I wrote it, there was a discussion about the difference between English and American marches, and this was something, as I said before, which I did go into. What I finally did myself to make a distinction was to have the British or the general marches in 4/4 and the one for Colonel Stout in 6/8. And it does invest it with an extra bit of gaiety, and the way it is used in the film does have a touch of humour about it, which I won't give away, but for those who've seen the film, they'll know what I'm talking about.
Now, the Bailey Bridge, as you mentioned, was the bridge that the English built.
This was an incredible invention, a bridge which was made up of pieces which you could take anywhere you liked in lorries, and it was a very successful invention. Naturally, it takes some time to assemble it, and there's a sequence in the film in which everybody is waiting most anxiously for this bridge to be built over the one that had been blown by the Germans, so that the advance can continue. And the music for this sequence is associated with that waiting period during which the bridge is being built. When it is ready, you will hear a great surge in the music when the tanks are able to progress again. And once again, you feel hopeful that the whole thing is going to be successful.
Music from the soundtrack to A Bridge Too Far, and we have next Human Roadblock.
By the way, these titles, you know, it's quite difficult to give a title to.
Who dreams up these titles?
Well, I'm afraid I have to take responsibility for that. If anybody thinks they're stupid, then I'm the guy who's responsible. When something to do with the Performing Rights Societies decrees that when you write the music, you have to shove a title down as well as calling it real so-and-so, number so-and-so. And I can tell you that when you're busy trying to create this music, the last thing you want to be racking your brains about is titles. So I usually put down the shortest and simplest thing that comes into my mind and don't waste time about it. Now, when you get to a soundtrack album, you've got to try and improve them a bit. But it is sometimes difficult to think up a title that makes sense when you've actually joined 3 different bits of music together from different parts of the film to make it come out as a better sound for the album. So anyway, so much for titles. Well, now, Human Roadblock is a fairly literal title for this piece of music, which is in the album is exactly as it is in the film. The Dutch civilians, in the midst of all this chaos and ruin, were still desperately trying to help the Allied troops, and they were trying to make roadblocks to prevent the German tanks. One of the things that had gone wrong, by the way, in this battle is that there weren't supposed to have been any tanks there, and by sheer chance the Germans had decided that two important German panzer tank divisions should be in a rest position right by Arnhem. This was a matter of luck. Now, where the Allied command were at fault was that they got information from the Dutch resistance that these tanks were there, but by that time they were so keen on the battle that they made excuses. They said, oh, well, they're probably not operational. They've taken such a pasting, they'd be no good now. But they were operational, and of course for troops which have landed from the air, they do not have the equipment to be able to cope long with tank forces. So anyway, the Dutch people did their best to help the Allies by building these roadblocks with overturned cars and so on, and they did even put human bodies on as just fodder for these blocks. And the scene which this music accompanies is one in which the resistance leader that we have met earlier in the film is engaged in making these roadblocks with his son, and his son is killed. And he picks his son up and he puts him on the road, on the block, and eventually the tank comes and actually flattens the whole lot.
Now we have Feudal Mission.
Well, this is another case in which there's more than one piece of music. The main part of it at the end is a sequence which is not thematically connected with anything else in the picture. It accompanied a scene in which the British troops were having supplies dropped to them from the air, and the supplies, unfortunately, were all dropping into the German lines, and the pilots had given strict orders to drop them where they were told to, and not to take any notice of what they saw on the ground, because it would have been the easiest thing for the Germans to put on British uniforms and alert that cause it to the supplies to be dropped in the wrong place. So there's really nothing much they can do about it. And in the scene concerned, one soldier does run out into no man's land, an area which is covered by German snipers, to try and recover one of the canisters which has fallen short. And it's a heart-rending scene because he does manage to get there and pick it up and starts running back, and then he's shot in the back and he drops the thing. It's a huge canister which you think he will hardly be able to lift, and it breaks open and all it's got inside is red berets. The music is consists of three parts, if you like. The first part is when he runs towards the canister, the middle section is where he lifts it up, and the last section is where he runs for safety and then is shot. I think that comes at the end of this section, and but there may be something following it. I don't quite remember what I put together with it.
Next up on the music from A Bridge Too Far, we have The Great Misspelling, as the album jacket has. It has the Wall River on the back, and it's you said it's something else.
So it does. You know, I have after all this time, I'd never noticed that. It is actually the W-A-A-L, it should be, and not W-A-L-L. I suppose in German, no, Dutch, it's pronounced something like Waal, you see. The Waal River. How strange.
Well, we're getting near the end of the movie, and we're up to Arnhem Destroyed now.
Yes, one thing about the album is it does basically follow the action, and that's why it does end on rather a downbeat, because the film does that. Arnhem Destroyed was the sequence that I mentioned earlier on, I think, when Laurence Olivier is driving through the ruins of Arnhem, which he's last seen as a beautiful city. It was one of the most attractive cities apparently in Holland, and he's driving through the ruins to meet the German commander to try and arrange a ceasefire to get some of the wounded out, and the music, I think, describes what he's feeling. Now, this, by the way, you can see but just by looking at his face. Usually in film music we like to try and do something oblique to the action where it's possible, but this is the case where I guess what he's acting and what the music is saying is the same. On the other hand, I think it does work.
The next to last track on your soundtrack album, To a Bridge Too Far, is Retreat.
Well, when it has been decided to call the battle off and to withdraw those that are left from the Arnhem area, by the way, there were 10,000 that dropped in that area and less than 2,000 came out, and they retreat at night, leaving those too badly wounded and the medical orderlies and the padres, do you have that word, padres, the clergymen, you know?
We got it from Mexico.
And the ambulance people, they stay behind to give the impression that the battle is still going on, and firing their guns and so on with what little ammunition they've got left. And the rest of them that can get out retreat through the rain, through a forest, and eventually they arrive at a river, and once they've got over that river they're going to be safe. And a curious thing happened, because I wrote this piece of music, and when I played it on the piano to Richard Attenborough, by the way, a lot of composers don't like playing their music on the piano to directors because they feel that it gives an erroneous impression of what it's finally going to be like. But I myself find it helpful, and it certainly was in this case, because while he liked what I had written, he said that there was one element lacking, and that was that although this was a defeat, for those that did make it back, there was an element of triumph in it. At least they made it, and to do it they had been incredibly brave and courageous, and it showed extraordinary endurance and all the rest of it. And at a certain point in the music that I'd written, he said, couldn't you at this point just bring in a feeling of a rhythm, of a beat underneath it, and perhaps slightly quicken the tempo there? Now, as I said before, we had this meeting only 2 weeks before the recordings, but luckily this and one other thing were the only things that I felt I wanted to change as a result of our meeting, and there was time to do this, and so that is the version of it you will hear.
Well, we're at the end of the movie, and now we have A Bridge Too Far march.
In a way, I've already told the story about that, of how we decided to not start the music where normally it would be the normal case, that's to say, either as the roller titles come up or a little before that, and to delay it. As a matter of fact, the first titles that come up are the names of the consultants on the movie, and those consultants were all generals who we have seen as colonels and whatever rank they were at the time in the movie, and we've been living for the last nearly 3 hours with these people, and I think it is rather an extraordinary moment when one realizes that the originals of the people played by Sean Connery and all the other stars were actually there on the spot when during the shooting to see that everything was done authentically. Now, just after these first names come up in silence, you will hear this sound of a drum coming in, and the music very slowly builds up. Now, in the last shot of the picture, we see Laurence Olivier and Liv Ullmann, the doctor and the woman who had given her house, which has been destroyed, for the wounded to be taken care of. We see them walking along this road with all their belongings in a little cart, and their children skipping around behind them. And if you look closely, you'll see that one of the kids has picked up a bit of wood, and he's pretending it is a rifle, and he's swinging his arms and he's marching along, in spite of all that he's been through in this virtual holocaust of war. Still, to be a soldier is something valid to him, which is one of the problems we have in the world. And I found this very moving, and it therefore gave me the idea of starting the music with what sounds like a toy drum, and then you just hear piccolos come in, playing the tune very simply, and then a clarinet comes in, a few more instruments are added, so it's almost like a little toy band in a way to begin with, and then gradually it builds through the titles up to the full orchestra. And this is not meant to be saying, great, you've had a marvellous time, send them out happy. That one is sometimes asked to do, by the way. In this case, what it is meant to be saying is, in spite of the horrors of war, and after all, which Americans know only too well after Korea and Vietnam, one suspects that men will continue to try and solve their problems this way. And I think that the music does work when an audience, if the audience has been moved by the picture, they sit there, because I've been there at screenings of the film when this has happened, they sit there in a sort of stunned silence, and then this music gradually creeps in, and in spite of it ending with a full orchestra, ostensibly playing quite a gay march, they're still going out looking very somber and perhaps in tears and so on. Now, this might be a moment for me to make one comment about the reception in America. I think that for some of the public, they've reached a stage through having seen, for example, Vietnam in their homes, in their sitting rooms, a real war on television, a war they weren't happy about anyway, that they have seen so much of this that at this particular point in time, some of them find a picture of this kind too much. That's to say, the message of it, they may feel they know already, that war's a bad thing, and that people do incredible acts of heroism very often to no purpose, and they'd rather go and see Star Wars for sheer escapism. Well, whether I'm right about this or not, it could well be, and I think that this picture will have a very long life, because I think seldom has an anti-war film been done with such integrity and without trying to be clever or to be funny, but just telling it the way it is. And I think that it will be a document of interest to people for many years to come.
Music from A Bridge Too Far, music composed and conducted by John Addison. John, thank you for being with us on Cinema Showcase.
It's been a pleasure.
And I want to thank Blaise Kistler, our technical director, and my assistant Bob Duggar for all their assistance on this program. I'm Dave Schwartz, and this is Cinema Showcase.